So he had like long been a heavy drinker, but he hadn't really shown up before like this drunk to a recording session. And he was also frequently appearing to live performances and studio recordings either late or stoned as well.
Freaking singers, man. That's all they ever do.
Yeah. Wouldn't that ruin your voice though?
Well, I think when you're a young 20-something-year-old, probably not.
Yeah.
If he would have been up into his, late 30s, mid 40s, it probably would have made his voice even more hot take, more atrocious than it already was. That's just my opinion, everybody. That is just my opinion. Listeners, do not get mad.
I was listening to it earlier today to get like in the mindset as well. And I don't know if there was one song that I was like, man, I cannot stand this.
It's probably Riders on
Yeah.
the Storm. It's pretty
Some of it was
repetitive.
good, but like, yeah. Or there was one that it kept like the lyrics and then the music when he wasn't singing was like jarring, like different. I don't remember, but yeah, by early 1969, Morrison had gained weight, grown a beard, and begun dressing more casually. And then their fourth album was released later that year. And during a concert in March 1969 in Miami, Morrison attempted to spark a riot and was screaming obscenities again. And 3 days later, 6 warrants were issued for his arrest. And because of this, many of the Doors' scheduled concerts were canceled. And on September 20th, 1970, Morrison was convicted of indecent exposure and profanity after a 16-day trial. So he was sentenced to 6 months in prison and had to pay a $500 fine.
That's not bad.
It's like $4,000 today.
Well, yeah, but he's a rock star, man. He's got all the money.
Yeah, like that's really not too bad. And 6 months only, I guess.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. After that, he was interviewed by LA Free Press and he expressed both bafflement and like clarity on the trial. He said he wasted a lot of time and energy with the trial, like about a year and a half, but he said before that he had a very unrealistic schoolboy attitude about the American justice system. He said if he hadn't had unlimited funds to continue to fight his case, he'd be in jail for at least 3 years. And every day he saw people go in, especially African Americans, and in 5 minutes get 20 to 25-year sentences. And he said if you have money, you generally don't go to jail, which is true.
I was about to say that's even true still today. So.
Right.
Yeah. I guess that was his first like reality check on that, I guess.
Right.
In late 1969, they released their 5th album, and also in 1969, he met Patricia. I should look this up. Patricia Keneally at a private interview for Jazz and Pop magazine, and they quickly developed a friendship which evolved into a long-distance relationship. So on Midsummer 1970, they participated in a hand fasting ceremony, but they never filed the paperwork to make it like a legal marriage. And then in October 1970, they recorded their final album with Morrison. And shortly after the recording session, after the recording session began, their producer Paul Rothschild, who had overseen all of their previous recordings, unexpectedly left the project. So the engineer Bruce Botnick took over as producer for that last album. So after finishing the recording for that album, he announced to the band his intention to go to Paris for a reprieve, which his band members thought was a good idea. And apparently also around this time, Morrison learned Patricia was pregnant, which he did not take well.
Rude.
Yeah. Yeah, and he wrote letters later that said he was planning on returning to Patricia in New York City in the fall of 1971, but he would ultimately never make it back to the States. So no one knows if he would have actually come back. But in March 1971, he joined his girlfriend, Pamela Corson, in Paris at an apartment she rented. So I think he was still seeing other people, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I read like something when he died, there was like 30 paternity action things against him from like women.
Oh, I 100% believe that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's probably every city he stopped in, man. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, probably. But yeah, in letters to friends, he described going for long walks through Paris alone. And during this time, he shaved his beard and lost some of the weight he had gained. And he also phoned John Dinsmore, who was the drummer, to ask him how the album was doing commercially, which that was the last any band member ever spoke with Morrison. And on July 3rd, 1971, Morrison was found dead in the bathtub of the apartment at 6 a.m. by his girlfriend, which he was 27 years old. The official cause of death was ruled as heart failure, although no autopsy was performed as it was not required by French law. Yeah, so it's like, how did they say heart failure? But whatever. His last words were reportedly, "Pam, are you still there?" And several individuals who say they were eyewitnesses said he died from an accidental heroin overdose. But without the autopsy, those claims couldn't be confirmed. So this brings us to the theories of what really happened.
What possibly really happened.
Yeah, what maybe possibly could have
Right.
happened.
Yeah, because we don't know. Also one thing, they put out 5 albums really fast, didn't they? Like, that seems like a lot.
Well, at that time, especially with bands that were exploding like that, you had record companies that wanted to capitalize as fast as they could, so they would do like album tour, album tour, album tour.
Okay.
So they were pumping out music like crazy in that time.
That makes sense. So he was probably exhausted too, weren't they? Like,
right. A lot of those guys in the mid and late 60s and 70s, they just got burnt out after a couple of those cycles because, I mean, you're just literally working 24/7.
yeah.
You know.
And drinking and partying whenever you're not working.
Yep.
All right. Well, I guess we'll get into the theories. So I guess we'll start with my first one. Because there was no autopsy ever performed, there have been a lot of controversy over his manner of death. And I would say, like, the most logical cause of death would probably have been alcohol poisoning, because Morrison was known to be a really heavy drinker, that he would drink, like, 36 pints of beer a day. So, like, that's a lot.
Wow. Yeah.
And he had gained 60 pounds in the months prior to his death, which may point to pancreatitis, which would cause insulin resistance and cause him to gain weight, and it would also affect the way his body processed alcohol. And another kind of fact that supports this is that when you have alcohol poisoning, your body temperature lowers really significantly. So there's kind of this theory that he got in the bath to try to warm up because he was so cold. And they also said that he was having trouble breathing, and alcohol poisoning also causes, like, your muscles to not fire properly, so your diaphragm wouldn't work correctly. And it would also affect your heart, so maybe he did die of heart failure, but it could have been brought on by the alcohol. And I mean, that's a lot of people die of alcohol poisoning, so that wouldn't be that crazy.
Yeah.
Well, he didn't live the most clean life up to this point either,
No.
so I mean, it could have been in combination with the drinking, like you were saying, but along with everything else that he did prior to this.
Right. And then kind of the next theory, and this is probably like the most famous theory, was that he died of a heroin overdose, and his girlfriend Pam lied to police to avoid getting in trouble for drug possession. I would say this is like fairly straightforward, and they did find residue around his mouth and nose, which would probably like indicate that it was an overdose, because I guess you foam at the mouth, I get a little bit. I mean, I wouldn't know, but you kind of foam up. And also Marianne Faithfull, who was a singer, was dating this drug dealer who supplied the Rolling Stones. And she said that he sold Jim the, like, final dose. Like, she didn't go with that night, but he went to Jim's apartment, and then Jim died. And he said that it was just, like, too strong. And Pamela Corson, his girlfriend, was also romantically linked to the same drug dealer.
Oh my gosh.
So, and she, like...
Hey, it was that kind of
Yeah,
time.
and she came out and said that. Also, he's married and with Pam, so Pam, I don't think, has a lot of morals.
I mean, he's not really married.
Well...
Yeah, what did they call that?
Hand fasting.
Yeah.
Because they didn't sign actual things to be married.
Right. It's kind of a agreement among friends, really.
But
Wow.
yeah.
I guess. Okay.
I mean, did he do heroin before? Like,
Like, I don't think that there was a lot of talk of that, which is kind of why I personally lean more towards alcohol poisoning because it didn't. I mean, but is that something that would have been publicized? I'm not sure.
right.
Well, I think it's kind of like a natural progression of things too. When people, I've seen a lot of the music stories that end like that. It starts off with drinking and maybe some more innocent illicit drugs, and then it just keeps going further and further and further and further.
Right.
Yeah.
Just trying to catch that next thing. So it very well could have been that in his last few months of life, he might have been experimenting with heroin.
That's true.
But I'm still more for the drinking thing because it's very well documented that he drank a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes more sense too, to me.
And then, kind of on this heroin thread, some people say, and especially the manager of a Parisian nightclub called Rock and Roll Circus, say that he actually died in the bathroom of the club that night, and that basically the manager saw him go into the bathroom with this drug dealer, or a couple, I guess it was a couple drug dealers, and then he didn't come out, so they had a bouncer like break down the door, and they found him unresponsive in the bathroom. And then there was a regular who was a doctor who checked him out and said, yeah, he's done. And they put him in a taxi and brought him back to his apartment because the club didn't want to get shut down for like having drug stuff happening. Like they didn't want to get in trouble. So they sent him back to his apartment, and possibly he was put in the bathtub to make it seem like he died a lot later than he did because the water was hot. And I believe even at 8 a.m. when they finally found his body, like 8 a.m. the next morning, the water was still warm, which is kind of odd to me. Because he supposedly went in the bathroom around 3 a.m., was talking to Pam at 5 a.m., and then at 8 a.m., the bathtub water is still warm. So that was kind of a weird little thing that I found. And some people who were at Rock and Roll Circus that night remember the DJ announcing to the crowd that Jim Morrison had died in the bathroom.
Oh my God.
But, it's kind of hard to substantiate those claims.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only I have heard of this one, and that's the only problem I have with it is how many moving parts there are to it.
Right.
You know what I mean? You had to have him go to the bathroom, you had to have him take drugs, you had to have him die in the bathroom. A bouncer kicked in the door, they got him in a cab, took him back to his apartment, and then filled up the bathwater. Like, there's so much in that arc of a story, where somebody would have seen them dragging him out of the bathroom or putting him in a cab. You know what I mean? It just it's
true.
a bit of a stretch for me.
That's true.
The bathwater is weird, though.
Yeah, I didn't know about that part.
But maybe it wasn't that uncommon to be kicking people out of clubs and throwing them in cabs, or like
That's true.
drugs. That kind of stuff happens. People pass out. So maybe it wouldn't have been that noticeable, but it definitely would be a lot more. Like Occam's razor, we're going to go with probably the most simple, that he just OD'd or something in his own home. But
Right.
yeah, that was like, I would say probably one of the more famous conspiracies is that he was actually in the club and they moved him around, which I don't know. To me, it does seem really far-fetched.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like, wasn't he famous even in Paris? Like, wouldn't have someone have noticed that that's Jim Morrison being dragged out?
Not necessarily during that era, because you got to think in that time, Europe had the Stones, the Beatles.
Oh, that's true.
That's what that was there. And I'm not saying that they weren't like aware of the Doors, but the UK and American thing still was kind of